Okay, so let's turn our attention then to the variant on the straight conventional reel, and that would be the level wind reel. And this has gained popularity over time, and probably the most popular of the selling reels these days contain a level wind feature in it. So this one happens to be a Shakespeare Wonder Reel. This one was made in 1940, and we know that because their model codes used to indicate the years that the reels were made. So this is a model GA, and G stood for 40, for 4 as the first number, and A stood for 0. So the model GA was a 1940 pre-war reel. The reason I selected Shakespeare is Shakespeare was the one that had the patent on the level wind feature, and it goes all the way back to the early 1900s. And actually Shakespeare designed his reel because he was up in Boston one day, and he was at a manufacturing plant that made thread, and he noticed that the way that they put thread onto a bobbin involved a mechanism similar to this. So he voted to incorporate the level wind into a fishing reel, much like we saw earlier with the Meiselbach reel, and it's been a popular feature ever since. So that feature is over 100 years old, and it has evolved over time. So it's come from an early reel that had a metal frame, single side drive. It's moved up in the world to something like the 70s and the 80s with the Penn. This happens to be a Penn Model 10, but not much has changed. You have a worm drive, you have a line guide, you have in this case they've added a drag to it. They've used plastic rather than metal sides, but for the most part the features and functions are the same. We've had the ever popular and always present, it seemed, Ambassador. That's been around forever, and the manufacture and design of this reel, although internally, has changed over time. There's 4 or 5 different types of internals. The exterior is very much the same. This one featuring metal side plates, this one being made in Sweden. And then this is a left-handed version of a Shimano Calcutta, and this is kind of where the reels are today in a level line feature. Single frame or solid frames to them for the most part, either plastic or metal. In this case it's a metal frame, again with a line guide featuring a worm drive and a pawl, which is exactly what was happening in this case in 1940, but since his patent date all the way back in the 1900s. So what does that reel look like on the inside? Well, let's take a quick look at the mechanics behind the Ambassador. I chose that because it's a very popular reel, and what you'll find is a couple of items here. If you look underneath here, you have a transition gear called an idler gear, and it's either a single tooth outside or it has 2 pieces to that gear, and it's made of plastic. The plastic drives a gear on what's known as a worm gear, and that can either be attached or it can be a separate piece. In the Penn reels it's a separate piece that binds it, but at any rate it's a snake-like or an X-like feature in there, and as it turns it drives a line guide and a pawl. The little pawl is a forked piece that fits in the line guide, and that travels in the slot. So that little guy is going to travel in the slot as it turns, and when it gets over to a corner it's actually going to be turned backwards by the gear itself. And I don't know if you can see it. I can see it, but it's a little tough, but it turns and runs back the course the other way. So those are the core parts. And I just took an exploded view here. This is off of a Penn Pier 209 reel, but you'll see in this case it also has that plastic transition reel or transition gear. And if we want to talk about the failure points on these reels, there's really a couple of failure points, and they all have to do with the weakest link in the chain. So this is not the right gear, although it will turn it, but this is kind of what it looks like in terms of the spool, turning the idler gear, turning the worm gear to turn the worm drive, and so on. And what happens is this is the gear that 9 times out of 10 is going to be the failure point in a level wind reel. The reason for that is it's plastic, not metal, but there's a reason why it's plastic. There's got to be some give in the reel based on the way the travel of the worm gears. But more importantly, when a reel gets hung up, you don't want to trash the whole reel. If this was metal, you would have, and you're trying to lurch that out of a rock, what's going to happen is this gear is going to bind this, and it's going to break a lot of different pieces. So the developers generally went with, let's go with a plastic gear, and if anything gives in terms of a snag or a break, that's going to be the gear that's going to chip. And by the way, they're inexpensive, and you'd rather replace one piece than going ahead and replacing the whole assembly. So what are the failure points on a level wind reel? It's the gears that drive the worm gear. You can get, if let's say that didn't budge, you can get wear in the teeth here that pawl is traveling on. And a lot of times what will happen is that pawl will get here, get a snag, has nowhere to go, and it starts rupturing the alleyways that it travels in, and then it just gets to the point where it can't work any longer. So you have the failure points being the plastic gear, the worm drive, and the pawl itself. So that pawl has 2 points on it. They can wear, they can chip, they can break, and when one or the other side wears too much, it can't make the turnaround. So we have a lot of times where I will get a reel into the shop that says my line guide is stuck all the way on the left or the right, and that's usually because one of the points of the pawl has broken off. So those are the working parts of the line drive reel. A lot of these reels, like this one, have a free spool release that you press down, and then after you're lining out, trip it and it comes back up. That's the main failure point of a reel of this design. I apologize, this one's dirty, but I just grabbed this one. This is an earlier design for the Ambassador, but they're all essentially the same. You press down on this lever. See if I can do this without losing something. That's going to push this fork underneath. Take the gearing off. You'll see that the forking goes underneath. When that fork goes underneath, turning this gear will trip that fork to push it back up, and that's how it comes out. But while it's in there, it's going to allow it's going to pull the pinion gear out to disengage from the spool. It's going to allow the spool to turn, and as soon as you turn that piece, it's going to re-engage this, and it's going to clear that mechanism back up. Last point on a reel like this, many of us become familiar with the anti-reverse dog, which is actually a fork. You'll see that it's 2 sides. It rides on a click ratchet, and the click ratchet goes in between that fork. So what will happen on reels like this is over time that fork will spread and not grab the click ratchet to pull it in. Again, maybe we can demonstrate by pulling this off. It's a little bit ahead of schedule here, but I guess we can't. I guess I have that shield on there. Okay, so this is your click ratchet. This is your anti-reverse. It's going to be hanging on there. Notice it's got 2 sides to it. You want to get each side with the click ratchet in the middle. There's a screwdriver for this. Just spread those tines. There we go. We're in on that now, so you have 1 tine on each side. As you're cranking, it's going to push the anti-reverse out so that it allows the reel to spin, and as soon as you backpedal, it pulls that dog in so that it can't retreat. So I'll just show it to you one more time there. Well, as you can imagine, if those forks get on the wrong side, if those forks become spread too wide that they can't grip, or if those forks separate and are broken, that anti-reverse won't operate. So what are the failure points on this? This is a good example of the reel because I got a heavy amount of grease, and it's old grease in here. That click ratchet will not slide easily if it has dried grease, and eventually it won't engage with the spokes underneath here to trip the reel. You have springs that can break, but rarely. You have an anti-reverse dog with that forked type assembly, which wears over time, and eventually you're going to have to replace the drag washers. If you want to say what's a weak point of these types of reels, it's a limited drag capacity on these particular reels. But that's the mechanics of how a level line reel works, from the earliest inceptions to the latest versions of those level lines. And if you take a look at the low profile bait caster like the Revo here, it's all the same. The anti-reverses have changed to an instant anti-reverse clutch in this, but essentially it's all the same underneath. They're going to have a trip mechanism that's going to release the free spool. Release in free spool is going to release the pinion gear. It's going to allow you to free spool out and cast, and then when you click the mechanism, it's going to reset this. So dirt, grease, wear on the drag washers, wear on the anti-reverse dog, dirt and grease to clog this mechanism. So if you have a bait caster, any of them, if you have a bait caster like this where it goes down but it doesn't come back up, it's dried grease. Best way to do that is just take a penetrating oil, spray it around the reel like that, let it sit for a while, go get a cup of coffee or something, come on back, and chances are you will have an assembly that can be worked free. That kind of is the highlights of what fails on level line reels. Kind of exhibit A or subsegment A to what fails on conventional reels. The rest of that is things we had talked about: general wear and tear on the free spool release mechanism, the drag washers, and in this case we now know the pole, the level line, the worm gear, and the plastic transition idler gear are all failure points there. So I hope that this is being informative and educational, and we'll move on to the next one, which is ever popular, and that is the spinning wheel.